The Holocaust is conventionally understood as a genocide targeting Jewish populations across Europe, which represents part of the ideological core of Nazi extermination efforts. However, an examination of the demographic and geographic realities of World War II suggests that the majority of victims, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were Eastern Europeans, particularly Slavic populations. This invites us to consider whether the Holocaust should be contextualized more broadly as a Slavic and Eastern European catastrophe, reflecting ethnic and geographic targeting rather than purely a religious genocide. Western European Jewish privilege in migration. Western European Jews, including German Jews, often had greater opportunities to emigrate before the escalation of the war. Arrangements such as the Havara Agreement facilitated the migration of German Jews, particularly those with wealth or Zionist affiliations, to Palestine. By contrast, Eastern European Jews, primarily impoverished and geographically isolated, faced insurmountable barriers to escape, leaving them disproportionately exposed to Nazi extermination policies. Beyond Jewish victims, millions of Slavic civilians and Soviet prisoners of war were systematically killed through starvation, forced labor, and outright execution. These groups were targeted not for their religion, but for their ethnicity and geographic location, aligning with Nazi plans to colonize and Germanize Eastern Europe under Lebensraum. The concept of Lebensraum was a critical component in the Nazi worldview that drove both its military conquests and racial policy. The word translates to living space and refers to the idea that the German nation needs territory and resources to protect itself and compete with other powers. The scale of these deaths, often exceeding 6 million when combined, arguably makes the Nazi genocide an ethnic and geographic holocaust, disproportionately affecting Slavs and other Eastern Europeans. Jewish identity within Eastern Europe. A significant portion of the 6 million Jewish victims were Eastern European Jews, particularly from Poland and the Soviet Union. If categorized by ethnicity and nationality, these victims represent a subset of the broader Eastern European demographic annihilated by Nazi policies. This reframing does not diminish Jewish suffering, but highlights the overlap between Jewish and Slavic identities in the region, further complicating the narrative. Non-Jewish victims of Slavic ethnicity, non-Jewish Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and other Slavs suffered immensely, with estimates of civilian deaths reaching tens of millions. These victims were targeted under racial and imperial ideologies that sought to decimate Slavic populations for German settlement and dominance. The sheer scale of Slavic and Soviet deaths is staggering. When compared to the 6 million Jews murdered, the majority are also Slavs, the death toll among Slavs and Soviet POWs is numerically more significant. Freedom to reflect and question historical narratives. It is not inaccurate to describe Nazi concentration camps as slaughterhouses for Slavic Europeans and Soviet POWs, given the immense loss of life among these groups. This coexists with the understanding that Jews were also specifically targeted, although the Slavic ones disproportionately more than Western European ones. The argument is not about minimizing one tragedy to emphasize another, but about ensuring that the historical record reflects the full scale of Nazi atrocities. By acknowledging both the targeting of Jews and the broader carnage inflicted upon Slavic Europeans, Soviet POWs, and others, we can better understand the full scope of Nazi crimes without forcing a hierarchy of suffering or intent. The importance of open discourse questioning established narratives should not be conflated with denial or subversion. Instead, it reflects the natural evolution of academic inquiry, encouraging more nuanced and inclusive understandings of historical events. Just as theology has been subjected to rigorous debate without fear of ostracization, so too should history allow space for reinterpretation, particularly when demographic evidence invites new perspectives. Avoiding dogma. Labeling critical inquiry as revisionist risks creating historical dogma where certain interpretations are shielded from scrutiny. Such an approach undermines the academic process and limits our collective understanding of the past. Acknowledging the disproportionate suffering of Slavs and other Eastern Europeans within the Holocaust narrative does not diminish Jewish suffering, but enriches our comprehension of the multifaceted atrocities committed by the Nazis. Conclusion. Reframing the Nazi genocide as a primarily Slavic and Eastern European catastrophe rather than exclusively a religious one encourages a more holistic understanding of the events. It recognizes the shared suffering of Jews and non-Jews in Eastern Europe while questioning the disproportionate emphasis on Western European Jewish narratives of migration and survival. Open discourse is essential to historical integrity, and reflecting on these issues without fear or stigma is crucial for a truthful and inclusive recounting of history. History is not sacred or immune to scrutiny. Like any field of knowledge, it must withstand rigorous questioning and re-evaluation. Questioning historical narratives does not inherently equate to denial or revisionism. It can often lead to deeper understanding and correcting inaccuracies. Just as in science, historical claims should be tested against available evidence, revisited as new data emerges, and openly debated. This process should not be stifled by fear of repercussions and the danger of academic taboo. By declaring certain topics off limits risks creating a dogma that ultimately undermines the pursuit of truth.